guy working as personal assistant, forced to become a woman. Brian was on an all-time high. A month ago he'd landed a job at a fashion house. Not one of the major companies. They design mostly women's fashion and imported about 60% of their marketable inventory, comprising silk and lace blouses, lingerie, and evening wear. However, he was learning a great deal about the industry, and best of all, he had just been promoted to personal assistant to the owner of the company. He had no idea what his job entailed, but without any previous experience in the industry, he was ready to do anything. Since leaving school, he had been employed in a variety of jobs, and now, at the age of 25, he finally felt as though his career path was heading in the right direction. At 7:30 a.m., he'd arrived at the office. He wasn't supposed to start until 9, but he was so eager to get on with it, he'd gone in early to try and familiarize himself with his surroundings. And it never hurt to impress the boss with your keen attitude. At least, that's what he'd been told all his working life. He had already gone through most of the filing cabinets, trying to get some idea of the type of work which would be expected of him. He was sitting at his desk studying a client file when she walked in. Although he had never met Trent, he would recognize her anywhere. She was one of the most beautiful women he'd ever seen in his life. In fact, she'd been voted in the top 10 most beautiful women several times by a women's magazine. Standing there in the doorway, her hourglass figure covered by a smart blue skirt and jacket, with a white blouse, her long wavy blonde hair and makeup right out of Vogue, was his boss. Not one of the many photographs he'd seen of her came close to capturing her beauty. Brian knew she was 35, but with her perfect skin, she could easily pass for a girl in her early 20s. She was 5 feet 8 inches tall and every inch a woman. "Good morning," she purred, as she glided over to him. "You must be Brian. I've heard a lot of good things about you. I see you're finding your way around all right. Tell you what, give me 5 minutes to settle in and then bring us both a coffee. Mine's white, and I'll spend an hour or so filling you in on your new position." She smiled down at him as she floated into the inner office. Even her perfume made Brian's head spin as she passed. Exactly 5 minutes later, Brian knocked on her door. She called him in and he opened the door, balancing the tray with the coffee in his other hand. Her office was more like an apartment than a place of work. There was a desk in the corner, but Miss Trent was sitting on a large leather lounge near a window. The sun shone through, forming a golden halo around her head and reminding Brian of the pictures of angels he'd seen when he was a boy. Brian, just in time, but the coffee down here and sit next to me." She indicated a table in front of the sofa, then patted the seat next to her. Brian tried hard not to spill the coffee as he placed it on the table. His hands were shaking so much he was both surprised and relieved at his success. "Now, where do you want to start?" She crossed her long perfect legs and her skirt rode high up her thigh. Brian had to tear his eyes away, and once again he breathed a mental sigh of relief when she didn't appear to have noticed his stares. They talked at some length about his various duties. She indicated at the outset that he would be expected to spend many nights working late. He would also be required to accompany her on various business trips, some of them quite lengthy. He told her he had no problem with that. Living alone with no ties, he was free to come and go pretty much as he chose. She seemed strangely pleased with his response, but Brian read nothing particular into this. Over the next few weeks, Sherry, she insisted he calls her by her first name, taught him a great deal about the business. She seemed to take a genuine interest in his progress, and any scrap of attention she gave him was like a gift from heaven, so completely besotted was Brian. When she called him at home one night after work, Brian was delighted. Not only at the opportunity to do something for her, but also because he'd never expected this amount of acceptance so quickly. "Brian, it's Sherry. I need you to collect some designs for me from the office and bring them around to my apartment tonight. You'll find them on my coffee table. By the way, have you eaten yet? No? Good. We can have dinner here while we do some work. See you in about an hour." Although he'd been to her apartment several times, they'd only been brief visits. so Brian was thrilled at the prospect of spending some time alone with her. Even though he spent most of the day with her, somehow the prospect of being alone with her in her private home excited him. He showered and changed in about 5 minutes and made it to her apartment in 50. She was on the phone when he arrived and opened the door, then raced back to the call. He put the designs on the table and sat down, staring at his boss. She was wearing a pink silk dressing gown, which had fallen open to the top of the thighs as she sat cross-legged by the phone. He found himself wondering if she was naked under the robe and fantasizing about what she looked like. With a start, he realized he was getting an erection and he quickly diverted his attention to the designs he'd brought with him. He blushed as he realized that she had been watching him stare at her legs, and he spent an agonizing few minutes trying to think what to say if she mentioned it. When she hung up, she walked over to the table and, to Brian's relief, got straight down to business. They discussed the designs, and though Brian had no concept of dressmaking, Sherry valued his opinions on the fashions from the male perspective. As she said, she could get 20 experts to offer opinions, but she wanted to know what effect the garments would have on the average man. They discussed the different fashion trends over dinner, and Brian was delighted by her genuine interest in his views. She even altered a few lines on the designs at his prompting. Taking her coffee, she moved over to the sofa and indicated that Brian should join her. "What age group does you think would look best in this?" she asked, holding up a sketch of a particularly revealing black mini dress. "What I mean is, are we limiting our potential market by designing something which only teenagers would wear?" "I don't think so," Brian replied thoughtfully. "I would imagine the slightly older women would leap at the chance to prove that they still have the figure to wear a dress like this. You know the type I mean, the ones who go to cocktail parties and that sort of thing." She smiled. "I go to cocktail parties, but I'm sure I don't have the figure, or the nerve to wear a dress like this. I can just imagine the looks I would get, the old mutton dressed up as Lamb looks." "You can't be serious." Brian felt personally insulted by the thought of anyone implying that Sherry was imperfect. "You'd look sensational in anything. The only problem would be that after you wore this, no one would ever buy it because they could never do it justice." He blushed again as he saw her smiling at his pathetic attempt at flattery. "That's very nice of you, Brian. Maybe I should let you choose my outfits in the future. You seem to know better than I do what suits me." Brian thought for one horrible minute that he'd offended her in some way. No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean you. That is, I was just trying to say that you have the sort of body. I mean you." She held up her hand to stop him, her lovely face lit up as she smiled delightedly by his compliments. "It's okay, I know what you mean. You don't have to get all flustered. Incidentally, thank you for the compliments." She seemed lost in thought for a short while, then appearing to have made a decision, she said, "You may be right about the female age group, but what I'd like to know is, what male age group does you think they'd appeal to?" Brian looked confused for a moment, then brightening he said, "Oh, I see what you mean. You want to know what the husbands would think of the outfits on their wives, is that it?" Sherry smiled. "Not quite, Brian, possibly the other way round." "I'm not sure I understand you." "It's simple really. We're thinking of expanding somewhat, and the marketing people tell me we've just about reached our optimum output with the present range, in women's fashion that is. So I had this brilliant idea, in all modesty, what about promoting our line to men?" She sat quietly while Brian digested this latest information. "You mean, you want to sell your clothes to the homosexual market?" "Well, yes and no. Homosexuals obviously, but there's a huge market for men who just like dressing up in women's clothing. They're completely straight sexually, they just get their kicks differently." Warming to the subject, Sherry continued, leaving Brian tried to take it all in. "Then there's mail order. Can you imagine how many men would like to wear our outfits but don't have the nerve to actually buy them from a shop? The potential is enormous. Then there are the men who don't realize how good dressing in women's clothing feels. If we can find a way to target that group, can you imagine the size of that market?" Brian was speechless. Sherry watched him for a while before asking, "Have you ever worn women's clothes, Brian?" No, of course not. He fired back. Why not? She continued, her voice very calmly. I just haven't. What do you think? I'm some sort of pervert? There, she exclaimed triumphantly, that's exactly the attitude we have to overcome, and that's where you come in. You're going to be my guinea pig. Now just a minute, what are you suggesting? She smiled, resting her hand on Brian's leg. I'm not suggesting anything, Brian. She began. Let's just say, it's another aspect of your job which you only do when you're here. You do like being here, don't you, Brian? He swallowed hard as she slid her hand up and down his thigh. Yes, of course I do, he replied truthfully. And you've already said you like our clothes. Yes, but... She held a long, perfectly manicured finger to his lips to silence him. Is it me? Don't you like being here with me? She sounded slightly hurt. Yes, no, it's definitely not you, and yes, of course I like being here. I can think of nowhere I'd rather be than right here. Once again a smile lit up her face, as she inquired impishly, nowhere? Then glanced towards the bedroom door. Brian blushed and looked down at the floor. As if to let him off the hook, Sherry returned to the designs. They discussed various aspects in more detail, returning once again to the age problem. Sherry seemed to come to a decision. I'll tell you what, I have several designs in my bedroom, from last year's catalogue. Why don't I model some of them for you, and you can tell me what you think? But one thing, you must be brutally honest. I don't want you lying just because I'm your boss. You don't need to worry about your job being on the line or anything silly like that. Just give me your honest opinion as to whether someone of my age should wear them. Brian didn't know how he was supposed to react to her suggestion, so he simply sat quietly while she changed in the other room. The first outfit was a pair of lemon slacks matched with a lemon blouse, which buttoned to the neck. What do you think of this? We sold quite a lot of them. I really don't think it suits you, someone of your age. It would look far better on an older woman. Terrific, I'm delighted you said that. She applauded. The truth is, it's just an outfit I wear around the house when I'm in one of my scruffy moods. To tell you the truth, I wouldn't be seen dead in it outside these four walls. Brian thought his chest would burst with pride. He was glad he hadn't tried to be diplomatic, as he had initially intended. I promise I won't try to trick you again. The rest of the clothes will be genuine. Sherry disappeared back into the bedroom. She took longer to change this time. She emerged, wearing a superb backless evening gown. It was full length, and though Brian was disappointed that it hid her legs, he had to admit it looked great. As she spun around, modeling the dress for him, Brian caught a glimpse of her legs. The dress was split to the top of the thigh on each side and offered a tantalizingly brief view of what Brian suspected was stocking tops. Apart from his mother, he'd never known anyone who wore stockings, and until now, he didn't realize how sexy they could be. Sherry struck a classic modeling pose, and the material on one side fell away, revealing one stockinged leg to the top. The sight had an immediate effect on Brian, and he crossed his legs in an effort to hide his growing erection. Sherry left the room, telling him to write down his opinions on each dress while she changed. He didn't hear her return, and when he looked up he couldn't stifle a gasp at what he saw. She was wearing a low-cut Japanese-style, silk dress. The hem reached to just above the knees, and Brian marveled at her ability to walk in it. It was so tight, she had difficulty separating her knees. Added to this, she was wearing stiletto heels, which must have been at least 5 inches. Do you think this is too tight? She asked coquettishly. Feel here, it's almost like a second skin. She took Brian's hand and placed it on her behind. In all his experience, albeit somewhat limited, with girls, Brian had never felt a more perfect behind. It was rounded and firm, yet totally feminine. As she was standing so close to him, there was no way he could hide the bulge in his pants this time. He looked up, and to his shame, saw her staring at his erection. But she didn't seem angry, in fact, she was smiling. Doesn't it feel wonderful? She asked suggestively. It's imported silk, very expensive. She slid her behind across and then away from Brian's, still outstretched, hand. "Wait till you see the next one," she called, as she entered her bedroom. Brian was beginning to sweat. He had no idea how to deal with the situation. If Sherry had been one of the girls he knew, he would be certain she was flirting with him. But there was no way this goddess could be interested in someone like him. The parade continued, each outfit a little more revealing than the last. Brian had a permanent hard-on, as the memory of the previous outfit lasted until her return. "There are only 2 more, Brian. I do hope you aren't getting bored," she called from her room. The next dress, while quite long, was by far the most revealing to date. It was pure white, and though the bottom half was a simple skirt design, the top was little more than a scarf covering little more than the nipples on Sherry's breasts. "The trouble with this one," Sherry said casually, "is that you can't wear a bra with it. I'm not sure my breasts are firm enough to wear something like this. What do you think?" She almost poked Brian in the face with them, and he blustered something about the fabric hanging perfectly. As soon as he said it, he blushed. Sherry didn't show any sign of noticing as she ran her hands over her stomach. "Feel this, I do believe I'm getting fat." Once again she took his hand, this time placing it on her flat stomach. Brian shivered as he came in contact with her bare flesh, and once again, she had to walk away to remove his hand. The last offering was almost more than Brian could bear. It was an ultra-short white leather dress, with a fine white net covering the stomach and cleavage. Black stocking tops showed below the hem. "This is my favorite. Unfortunately, I don't think I've got the legs to get away with wearing something this short. But it feels so good to wear, I had to try it just this once." She walked over and bent her knee toward his face. Rubbing the leather, she said, "Just feel how soft the leather is." This time, she placed his hand on her thigh. There was no way to touch the dress without his hand sliding over the stockings. Brian was shaking like a leaf as he ran his hand over her thigh. Sweat was pouring out of him at the nearness of Sherry. She left his hand on her thigh for several moments then, as she turned her head to read the notes he'd written on the various outfits. Then she pulled away quickly. "Brian," she sounded shocked. Brian was terrified she was about to throw him out for touching her leg. "You're soaking wet. Why didn't you tell me the air conditioner was playing up? Look at your shirt, it's stuck to you. Come on, take it off immediately, and into the shower with you. You'll catch cold sitting there in that. I'll see if I can find you something for you to wear." Brian silently obeyed, relieved that she hadn't been angry. Being aware that he would have done anything she'd asked of him, no matter what it was, a shower seemed to be a relatively insignificant request. While he was in the shower, Sherry walked in and stood watching him for a few moments. He tried to pretend he wasn't embarrassed, but the truth was, he was terrified she'd laugh at his slender physique. Finally, she spoke. "Why do men insist on keeping all that hair on their bodies? It looks so, I don't know, dirty, I suppose. At least women have the good taste to have it removed, or maybe it's just that we're cleaner than men." Turning on her heels, she walked out of the room, much to Brian's relief since he was finally able to breathe again. But not for long. Sherry returned and hung a black silk dressing gown on the door before walking over to Brian and presenting him with a shaving brush and 2 safety razors. He accepted them silently, and she again departed, this time saying, "If you intend to sleep in my bed tonight, you'll get rid of that hair all over your body. Oh yes, and make sure you use plenty of powder all over your body. I don't want you sweating all over my sheets." It took Brian an eternity to grasp what had just happened, not the shaving part. He didn't really care, and it would always grow back. No, what really stunned him was the fact that there was even the remotest possibility that he could sleep with Sherry. Suddenly galvanized into action, he quickly lathered and shaved both legs, then deciding he may as well be thorough, he shaved his crotch, stomach, what few hairs he had on his chest, and his underarms. When he was certain he'd removed every hair, he rinsed himself off and stepped out of the shower. When he dried himself off, he found the talcum powder in the cabinet and, as instructed, dusted himself generously with it. He realized she had taken all his clothes away, including his underwear, and he was left with no option but to don the dressing gown. self-consciously, he entered the lounge room. Sherry, still dressed in the leather outfit, appeared not to notice him as she read through his notes. Quietly he sat down at the other end of the sofa and she continued reading until, "What's this word, Brian?" She slid over to him, her perfume filling his nostrils. The skirt riding high up her legs exposed bare flesh. Brian interpreted his handwriting, and they discussed his opinions at length. She didn't bother to adjust her skirt, and he was grateful to be able to cover himself up with the writing pad. With no underwear on, his prick was almost pushing the pad out of his hand, and he was praying she wouldn't ask him to stand up. So nervous was he, that he was visibly shaking, and Sherry noticed this. "I knew you'd catch a cold, look at you, you're shivering. We'd better get you dressed, come on, into a bedroom with you right away." She took his hand and led him into her bedroom. Although delighted to be going into what he considered to be the Holy of Holies, he was a little disappointed that she wanted him to get dressed again. It seemed he wasn't going to be granted the ultimate honor after all. "Start with these," she said as she handed him a pair of tan stockings. Brian took them from her and stared at them and then her. "What do you want me to do with them, Sherry?" he asked innocently. "Put them on, of course. Oh, I'm sorry, you haven't worn any before, have you? You roll them up like this." She took one from him and demonstrated. "Then you simply pull it over your foot and roll it up to your leg. Here, try it." She returned the rolled up stocking to him and opened one of the many drawers in one of several mirrored dressing tables. "You mean you actually expect me to wear these?" "I explained all that to you earlier, Brian. I thought you understood what was required of you. After all, how will it look if the department head of men's fashion has never tried any of the outfits? Think about it, Brian. A major buyer is discussing one of the outfits and asks, 'Does it feel as comfortable as it looks?' To which you reply, 'How the hell would I know? What do you think I am, a fag or something?' Well, do you think you'll make the sale? Now hurry up and get into these and we can get you into bed before you catch a cold." Though he was still far from convinced he wanted to wear women's clothes, the incentive was much too great for Brian to do anything but accept his fate. He was pleasantly surprised at how cool and smooth the stocking felt as he slid it up to his shaven leg. He soon had the other one rolled and in place. "We'll use this to hold them up," Sherry said. Brian looked up to see her moving toward him holding out a pink satin and lace corset. By the time he'd decided to react, she was already lacing the corset up the back and he could feel it gradually pulling him in, tighter and tighter. "This should feel great. It was made especially for you, as were all the clothes you'll be trying from now on." "But how? Remember when you were told you had the job, you were measured for your uniform. Well, in a way, this is it. You'll have to wear the corset for the next few days until you get used to it. Then there are a few other things I'd like you to try." "There, finished. How does that feel?" "Tight?" Brian suggested. "Obviously, but don't worry, you'll soon get used to that. Now, time for bed, I think." She pulled the bedclothes down and indicated to Brian that he should climb in. As he lay down, he couldn't help but notice, not only did the ceiling have a mirror, but also the wall at the head of the bed. He decided it must be some clever designer's idea of art. "You don't mind sharing the bed with me tonight, do you? I really don't want to have to make up the spare, and I'm not in the mood to sleep on the sofa." Without waiting for an answer, she started to undress. "I hope you aren't watching me. My figure isn't what it used to be and I'd be embarrassed if I thought you'd seen me naked." He was but quickly turned his head. "It's been a long time since I shared my bed with a man. I hope I can trust you." Naked, she slid in beside him and turned out the light. Then she kissed him lightly on the cheek. She said goodnight, turning away from him. There was no way Brian could go to sleep. He'd been staring into the darkness for a few minutes when Sherry suddenly turned and spoke to him. "You really are a very sweet man, Brian. I'm so glad you decided to run the men's department." Brian was about to say that he hadn't yet when she leaned over and kissed him again, this time a little more warmly. Then she turned over and prepared to sleep. "It's no good, I can't sleep now. Are you awake, Brian?" "Yes, wide awake." She turned to face him, moving closer. Good. Why don't you tell me more about your opinions on the clothes you saw tonight? The silk dress, for instance. Don't you think I'm a little fat to wear a dress as tight as that? As she spoke, she moved even closer until her body was touching his. She rested her hand on his chest as she spoke to him. Absolutely not. You have the most perfect body I've ever seen. The darkness seemed to give Brian courage, and he was soon reciting her many features, and how they filled out the clothes. What do you think is my best feature? Sherry asked. As she did so, she began rubbing her hand over Brian's chest, pinching his nipples and planting small kisses on his shoulder. Her breathing was becoming slightly labored. I don't think you have the best feature. You're perfect in every way, Brian answered honestly. Her hand moved down to Brian's stomach and her breathing increased in tempo. Tell me what you like about my body. Everything. You have the most perfectly shaped breasts I've ever seen. Your legs are so long and smooth any man would willingly kneel down and lick them from toe to thigh. Her hand reached his thigh, then to Brian's disappointment, left his body completely. As he spoke to her, he could feel her pushing her body into him, her breathing getting heavier and heavier. Brian felt the back of her hand brush his outer thigh and he knew she was playing with herself. Her breath was coming in gasps as she pleaded with Brian to continue. When you put my hand on your beautiful behind, I knew I would never feel anything more magnificent. No sculptor could possibly create a work of art like it. After feeling your superb ass, I know I've been ruined for any other woman. None could come close to your beauty. Every woman ever born is ugly compared to you. Oh yes, 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 tell me what you think of my breasts again. Tell me, she insisted, but Brian knew instinctively that she would not hear anything he said. She was in the final throes of orgasm, her breathing reached fever pitch as she moaned and writhed against his body and her hand. She suddenly stiffened as she reached the pinnacle. Tell me. How wonderful. I am ... Yes. Yes. Oh, yes. She lost herself in bliss. Just hearing her was almost enough to make Brian come, almost but not quite. He wanted to play with himself just as she had, but something told him it wouldn't be wise, so he restrained himself. Never before had he felt so turned on and at the same time, so helpless to do anything about it. His throbbing prick ached to be rubbed, but it remained untouched while the woman next to him screamed in final ecstasy, then her spasms decreased, and finally, she lay sated against him. Despite his desperate needs, Brian eventually fell into a deep sleep. Sherry held him close and the comfort and warmth of her body relaxed him. He was wakened by Sherry's touch on his limp penis. He looked down to see her shoulders across his stomach. She seemed to be playing with him, and he knew she was finally going to make him come. At least, he thought he knew, but as his cock stiffened, he felt a restriction at the base. The harder he got, the tighter the restriction. What are you doing to me? He asked in pained tones. You'll see, just be patient, I'm almost finished. There, it's on. Would you like to see? Sherry asked excitedly. She moved away to give him a better view. As Brian looked down at his now fully erect penis, the full horror of what she had done sunk home. She had fitted some type of metal ring around his cock and balls. It was obvious now that she had no intention of letting him come until he left her home. He moaned as he considered his fate. Sherry laughed. Don't worry, I'll take it off one day. What do you mean, one day? How long am I going to stay here? He queried. Had she taken him prisoner or something weird like that? That's the beauty of it, she said in an excited voice. It doesn't matter whether you leave or not, you can only get the rings off with the key and I have that safely hidden. No matter where you are, part of you will stay with me. Isn't that wonderful? I don't understand, why me? You could have any man you want. Why do you need me so much? Because you tell me what I want to hear, and mean it. Most men only say it to get their way, but you really mean it. Nothing excites me more than controlling a man with my body. You'd do anything for the chance to make love to me. Wouldn't you? She demanded Brian's reply. You know I would. He answered quietly. Yes, I do. She sighed triumphantly. Then she swung her leg over his head and slid her pussy slowly up to his mouth. He knew he would not be able to resist when it reached him, and he didn't. However, he hadn't anticipated what happened next. As he lapped at her sweet juices, she took his rock-hard penis in her mouth and sucked it. He could feel himself building to a climax, just as he knew she was. Then, almost without warning, she started coming. At the same time, he felt himself shooting from way down in his feet, so intense was his need. But just as he was about to shout out in exultation, everything stopped. He could feel the sperm, trying to force its way out, but unable to pass the constriction. It was the worst agony he'd ever known, the agony of unfulfilled anticipation. Please, let me come. I promise to do or say anything you want. Just let me come once. He begged. Not yet, maybe tomorrow. Then again, maybe not. It all depends how much you please me, and you know how to please me, don't you, Brian? She pushed her soaking pussy into his face, urging him to eat her again. Despite his helplessness, Brian still felt an overwhelming urge to pleasure this incredible lady in any way she wished. Even though he couldn't come himself, he knew there were thousands of men who would swap places with him anytime. Sherry really was the most beautiful woman in the world. After he'd satisfied her needs for the third time, Sherry seemed content. She left the room, soon returning with his clothes. I'm sure you want to go home and change before you go to the office. Look, it's 9:30 now. Why don't you take the morning off and I'll see you later, say 1 o'clock. Brian stood up and reached round to untie the corset. What are you doing? Sherry asked. I thought I only had to wear this last night. Surely you don't expect me to keep it on all day, do you?